So Jan Westerhoff originally trained as a philosopher and an orientalist. So his research focuses on philosophical aspect of the religious tradition of ancient India. Much of his work concentrates on Buddhist thought, especially Madhyamaka, as we know it, as preserved in Sanskrit and Tibetan sources. He also has a lively interest in classical Indian philosophy. His research on Buddhist philosophy covers both theoretical and normative aspect. And today he will talk about the place of rebirth in Buddhist philosophy. So welcome with me, Jan Westerhoff.
Well, thank you, Denise, for this very kind introduction. Can you all hear me? Well, yes, wonderful, good. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about rebirth in Buddhist philosophy. And because I'm also talking a little bit about karma, I should probably start out by saying a little bit about my own karmic connection. I'm very happy that most recently we can continue connection via one of my own teachers, David Ruick, who passed away 3 years ago. He wanted his personal library to be given to an educational institution in Asia. And so we were very fortunate to be able to find an agreement with Rangjung Yeshe to host the library. It is still somewhere in the processing, so it hasn't arrived here. A great benefit to the students here. Okay, so there's so much of by way of introduction of my own connection with Rangjung Yeshe. So today I want to talk a little bit about the place of rebirth in Buddhist philosophy, and I basically want to structure this talk into three big sections. So first of all, I'm going to say a little bit fairly elementary things about how rebirth is conceptualized in Buddhist philosophy, primarily in Abhidharma. Then secondly, I'm going to say something on the notoriously controversial topic on how essential rebirth is for Buddhism and the whole question of naturalized Buddhism and what that might mean. And then in the final section, I want to think a little bit about the compatibility or not of a naturalistic understanding of the relationship between mind and body and the Buddhist conceptualization of rebirth, or at least some possible ways of conceptualizing the Buddhist conceptualization of rebirth. Okay, so that's the menu for today. So I'll expect to be talking about sort of 45 minutes, and then we can afterwards have some time for questions. Okay, so first of all, how is rebirth conceptualized in Buddhist philosophy? Well, as everybody here knows, in Buddhist philosophy rejects the existence of a substantial permanent personality core, soul palette, as it is sometimes called, the notion of an Atman that we find in much of classical Indian philosophical theories. And of course, the Buddhists have an alternative notion instead of the notion of an Atman that they employ. So it's usually referred to as the notion of a Pudgala, or the person. And this person is considered to be a permanently changing causal complex of physical and mental properties, right? So you've got the 5 skandhas, 4 psychological or mental skandhas, and 1 rupa skandha, the physical skandhas. And they are all, is in the Abhidharma analysis, made up of very short-lived momentary entities, the so-called dharmas, and they will form this kind of causal complex or causal flow. And this is what, according to the Buddhist understanding, the notion of a person or Pudgala denotes. So central here in thinking about that is a fundamental ontological assumption that we find in all Buddhist traditions. It's quite interesting to think about where this actually comes from, but it is there from the very beginning. And this is the idea of Mariological nihilism. So what I mean by that is a theory of wholes and parts. So that is Mariology, a theory of wholes and parts, which assumes that the parts are real, but the whole is not, right? So if you say have a bicycle and the bicycle is a whole that is made up of many parts, then the mereological nihilist says, okay, well, there are all the parts of the bicycle that are arranged bicycle-wise, but there is not over and above the bicycle parts in arrangement, a bicycle. Yeah? And that is obviously very important in this context here, because then you can say, well, it's the same with the person, right? You've got all the different parts of the person. You've got the dharmas that make up the pudgala, this causal flow, but there is nothing more than that. There isn't a whole they all compose, which has a separate reality apart from the parts. Yeah? And so via these two fundamental ideas, the ideas that the a person is basically a complex of physical and mental things. And the second idea that there is no whole over and above the parts. When you put those together, you get an argument for the Buddhist theory of Pudgala Nadatmya, or the emptiness of persons, showing that there is no Atman which would somehow sit on top of all the skandhas. Right. Okay. So now, of course, that raises the question then: what is actually reborn? Yeah. So if you are an Atmavadin, then you find it very easy to answer that question: what is reborn? Because you have an entity. You've got this soul palette that passes through the different bodies, right? And you've got the famous simile in the Gita with, you've got like a person changing their clothes, so the Atman changes their bodies. Another simile you might use is that of a thread going through a set of pearls. The pearls are the different bodies, and the thread is the Atman going through all of them. Yeah, of course you can't have that in the Buddhist conception because there's no Atman. So that then raises the important question, which the Buddhists were challenged with from the very beginning of their theorizing: what then connects the last moment of my present life with the first moment of my next life? Yeah? Or to put it more strongly, what ensures that I don't end up with somebody else's karma? Right. So if I don't have have this kind of Atman identifier, which labels every karmic seed as mine, and then of course in the next round, because the Atman is still around, I'll end up with all the karma connected with my Atman. How does it work for the Buddhists? Because it seems you can't really have a conception of karma, or a conception of karma as the Buddhists want to have, if you do all these virtuous deeds and then somebody else gets the traces of them in the next life. Okay, so the Buddhists try to answer this challenge, of course, from the very beginning of their theorizing. So I'm going to look at two very famous approaches of answering that. One is from a paracanonical text, as probably written somewhere or composed somewhere 100 years before the beginning of the Common Era to 200 years after the questions of King Milinda and the famous Milinda Panha. So what is happening in this dialogue is it's a dialogue between a monk called Nagasena and one of the Bactrian kings, or the kings that were left after the invasion of Alexander the Great to India. His Greek name was Menandros, and the Pali name is Milinda. And so we have this dialogue between Nagasena and Milinda. And because he's not talking to a scholar, but he's talking to a king, he uses a lot of similes in order to explain what's going on. And so King Milinda asks exactly the same questions and says, okay, so if there's no Atman, how do we know the karma goes with the right kind of person? And then Milinda says, right, well, consider the example of a man who lights a fire in the wintertime and in his house, and then that kind of gets out of control and it burns the field of the neighbor. Then the first guy couldn't really defend himself by saying that it was actually a different fire that burned the field, because the fire that he had in his kitchen was like that big, and then there was this huge conflagration in the field next door. So they must be distinct, so he can't be responsible. Yeah. Even though the two fires are not conventionally or even ultimately the same, it's still conventionally true that the same fire that the first man had in his kitchen burned the second man's field. And why is that? Well, of course, we are all, operating in an Abhidharma framework here, because ultimately, at the fundamental level, there is a series of dharmas momentary phenomena, so different instances of different moments of fire, which form a causal sequence, which connect the former and the latter, right? And the reason why we can say, well, it's the same fire that burned the other guy's field is because there's the causal sequence that starts in the kitchen of the first and then ends up with a big fire in the field of the neighbor. Yeah, and Melinda says, okay, it's exactly the same with karma, because what's happening there is that you've got the continuity of the skandhas and you've got the causality there as well, and it's via the causal chain that you can make sure that the karma attaches to the right kind of person, in the same way in which you can have, responsibility, legal responsibility here. In this case, you can have karmic responsibility in another way. Okay, so that's sort of a standard way of explaining that. Another very famous text that covers this problem is in Nagarjuna's very short work, Essential Verses on Dependent Origination, Pratitya Samutpada Hridaya Karika, a very interesting text that gives a variety of similes for how reincarnation is supposed to occur. And so I've given you three here. One is a student listens to a teacher and gets information from the teacher. A second is that a seal is impressed in clay. And the third is that the mouth waters when the word sour, or in the Sanskrit amlaka, which is sour fruit, and that word is heard, then your mouth waters. And what is interesting here is that Nagarjuna uses that in order to explain transfer from one life to another, but it's quite different from the Abhidhamma style example that we find in the Lindapanna, because here we don't have anything that is really transferred, not even, we should say, some kind of causal impulse or causal efficacy, right? I mean, it seems that the closest that we can probably phrase this in modern terms is that what is transferred here is information, right? So it goes from the student to the teacher, and it goes from the shape in the seal into the clay. And something similar happens when, a specific kind of word triggers a physiological reactions in your body. There's obviously nothing being transferred in terms of an entity. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say much about the difference between these two approaches here, even though that is very interesting, because in the Abhidhamma approach, it's very fundamental that we have this ultimately real causal sequence. But of course, for the Madhyamaka, the causal sequence and causality is not ultimately real, right? So for them, karmic causality and everything else can only be conventionally real. But we can, I think we can ignore this complication here and simply focus for the moment on the Abhidhamma conception, where the idea is that the physico-psychological components of this life and the next form a continuous causal chain. And then no matter or entity is transferred from one life to the next. So there's no kind of there is no kind of Atman or anything that is transferred. At most, we get a kind of a causal impulse from one dharma to the next. So in the Abhidhamma picture, we have, at the level of ultimate truth, we have a causal sequence. And at the level of conventional truth, I'm the same person as my reincarnation, though there are no persons at the level of conventional truth. And why is that the case? Well, because there is at the level of convention, this connection between the causal bits of my mind and my body, which are related in the same way. Yeah. So that's the Abhidhamma picture. Now, that brings me to the second part of what I want to talk about today, and that's the question of how essential this whole notion of rebirth actually is for the for Buddhist thought in general. Yeah? And this has been discussed quite a lot in what might be called Buddhist modernism. And the reason for that is that, of course, rebirth, as it's traditionally understood in Buddhism, implies the continuity of mind after the death of the physical body. Yeah? And this is commonly deemed to be incompatible with naturalism. Naturalism, of course, can mean a lot of things, but in the present context, I mean by the idea that the mind is what the brain does, and so if the basis which makes this happen, namely the operation of the brain, when that ceases at death, then there's also nothing that can continue operating on the basis of this. Now, and then the argument that you often hear in kind of forms of what sometimes something which is called is humanistic or humanist Buddhism is the idea that rebirth was part of the Buddhist cultural environment, but is not a core part of his teaching. Now, and so it is something that the Buddha referred to because that was what you did, and most of the people he talked to believed in karma and rebirth. But it's had he talked to a 21st century audience, he would have left this all away. And the challenge is then to construct a version of Buddhism not committed to rebirth. So we cut all of that out and then see what we are left with. Now, I'm actually quite critical when it comes to the prospects of this form of what you might want to call humanistic Buddhism without rebirth. And so here are a couple of difficulties that we find with that. So one is, of course, that if that is really true, then it seems to be that attaining nirvana is not such a big deal as it's usually taken to be. And Richard Hayes has phrased that fairly well when he says that if there's no rebirth, then nirvana comes automatically to every being that dies, regardless of how that being has lived, right? So if we have here the understanding of nirvana, which is the complete blowing out of all physical and mental properties and all karmic traces and everything to do with it, which is, I think, one plausible interpretation of the ideal of the arhat, at least. If that's the case, and if there is no continuity of the mind without the continuity of the body, then, of course, once your body has died, your mind is going to die as well and is going to completely disappear. And then it seems to be that everybody automatically achieves nirvana when they die. Now that is, of course, has various difficulties attached to it. So one, of course, being that, if you think you can obtain nirvana simply by dying, and it seems to be that we can become enlightened or attain nirvana simply by killing ourselves. And that doesn't seem to be what Buddhism recommends. And then, of course, it gets worse if you then phrase that whole material within the Mahayana context and say, okay, well, it's what the Bodhisattva wants to do is he wants to bring all beings to nirvana, right? And then it seems to be that the easiest way to do it is by killing them all, right? Because then they all obtain nirvana immediately. Yeah. So obviously something has gone wrong here. Yeah. And the question is, what has gone wrong? And okay, so here are some responses that we sometimes find in the literature to this, what you might want to call the suicide argument. So the idea that in naturalized or humanistic Buddhism, nirvana can be obtained by suicide. So I think that at least 4 different responses here that can be given. One is this sort of synchronous version of the compassion argument, where it says, okay, well, if you kill yourself, then other beings would suffer because of your suicide. And this is why a Buddhist, even though he doesn't believe that there is anything happening after death in any case, wouldn't want to kill themselves, right? Now, I mean, that is, I think, the weakest of all the arguments, because if you're worried about other people suffering, then according to this framework, of course, it seems to license the even more extreme consequence of mass murder, right? Because then nobody suffers, because everybody obtains nirvana immediately. So that's probably not going to be very helpful. Then we also have a sort of a diachronous version of the same argument, which says that, well, if you kill yourself, then you lose the ability of doing good for other beings in the future, right? So you should continue living even though you think that nirvana comes automatically after death, because you can help beings in this life. Yeah. So this is, I think, a slightly better attempt. But I think that the difficulty I see with this is that if the first noble truth holds, and that means that all experience is fundamentally suffused by dukkha, then whatever positive consequences our own actions can have in this being for other living beings will be a little more than honey on the razor blade of existential suffering, to use a metaphor by Shantideva, falling well short of the final liberation of nirvana. Yeah? Obtaining this final liberation, however, doesn't require any effort at all. It will happen automatically if we are to believe to the naturalist, right? So as such, a support for moral purpose in our staying alive for the benefit of our contemporaries and descendants appears to be rather thin. Okay. The third point that is sometimes raised is the idea that, well, Dharma is in a way its own reward, right? So Buddhist practice has good consequences in this life, so you don't actually practice it because you think there's something going to happen in terms of nirvana, but you have the good consequences here and now, right? Ehipassiko, look and see what kind of consequences it has as you practice now. And then you don't need to worry about nirvana. Yeah? So this has been summed up fairly well by a contemporary author. He says the most important thing then is to live a skillful, compassionate life. If we do this, we need not worry about what may or may not happen after death, since if there is rebirth, we will have established a wholesome foundation for our next existence. And if there's no rebirth, it won't concern us. We need only rely on the benefits of, we need not rely on the benefits of some reward after death, because there are great benefits to be gained here and now through spiritual practice. Yeah? Now, this strikes me as a really bad argument. So consider the following scenario, right? So you set out to travel to some remote country, and I try to sell you a large quantity of a fairly expensive snake oil mosquito repellent to protect you from mosquito-borne diseases. And then you ask me, well, but are there really all these aggressive mosquitoes where I'm going to travel to? And then I say, well, I really don't know whether there are any mosquitoes or not, but just assume, right, if there are, then you'll be very happy that you bought my snake oil. And well, if there aren't, then I can guarantee you that you don't have any problems with mosquitoes, right? So you can only win. Now, in the same way in which you wouldn't really be taken on by a salesman like that, I think you would also want to argue, or need to argue, that the benefits of spiritual practice are higher than the costs, right? So Buddhist practice has good consequences in this life, but the question is also, you know, what kind of price do you have to pay in order to achieve these good consequences? And what is meant by spiritual practice is basically the life of a homeless ascetic. Then at least these costs appear to be very high. So it seems to be that more needs to be said here. You can't just say, you know, Dharma needs to hold some states, but you also need to say something about the relation between wholesome states and the practice you need to do in order to achieve them. Finally, you sometimes hear the argument that, well, suicide results from an unwholesome mental state. All unwholesome states should be avoided. So no matter what Buddhists believe about future lives, they wouldn't kill themselves. Well, sure, but presumably for the Buddhists, you want to avoid states of anger and so on because of their consequences, because of their karmic consequences, and all of their immediate consequences, actually. But of course, in this context, there are no further consequences, right? Because if nirvana is really the extinction of the mind and the body, then there are no further consequences to be had. So in a way, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Okay. So I think a form of Buddhism that rejects or is agnostic about rebirth will find it very difficult to account for most of the practices that constitute the training along the path to enlightenment, right? So to this extent, the assumption of the continuity of mind after death and rebirth are, I think, an essential part of Buddhist thought. Now, I think the question is of whether you can construct a version of Buddhism without rebirth, and whether that is still Buddhism. Well, I mean, of course, you know, who's going to answer that, and who's going to say what is really Buddhism? But I think the challenges that you have if you take this kind of premise out of the Buddhist thought worlds are so numerous that it is a position where you should probably think in the other direction and think, okay, so is there actually anything we can say in terms of support the Buddhist idea of the continuity of the mind after the death of the physical body, and the continuity of the person in the kind of rebirth in the conventional level. Yeah, and so this is the final topic that I want to talk about today. So exploring the consequences of some ideas about the relation between mind and body, which is at least coherent with most of contemporary thinking about minds and brains, that might give us some insight in how to think about all of this. Yeah? And so the challenge really is to find a way to account for the possibility of the continuity of consciousness after the death of the physical body along broadly naturalistic lines. And so I want to talk about two accounts that might help us to think a little bit about this, and it might provide a way of integrating our contemporary thinking about how the mind works with these kinds of ideas, right? So one is a form of constructivism that goes back to an 20th century philosopher called Nelson Goodman. And the second is a theory of what I call cosmological duplicates, which you will find discussed interestingly in various accounts of contemporary cosmology. So I'll start with Goodmanian constructivism. And so here's just the sort of the potted overview. If you want to know more details, I recommend his very short book, Ways of World Making from 1978, which has all that explained in greater detail. But here's the punchline, right? So the fundamental idea is that it's not just scientific theories or social institutions that are constructs, but according to him, everything is a construct. Yeah. And now the argument works via a couple of steps. The first is the idea that every construct is constructed from something which is itself a construct. So this first premise just captures the fact that for him there cannot be any non-constructed objects that serve as the foundation for the constructional hierarchy. Right? I'm not going to argue for this premise here. Apart from noting that once we transpose it from the idiom of construction to that of dependence, then number one becomes the claim that every dependent object depends on something that depends on something in turn, which follows directly from the Madhyamaka claim of universal emptiness, right? So you have dependence all the way down, and in Goodman's case, you've got construction all the way down. Yeah? A second point, every construct must be constructed from something, from some basis of construction. Yeah, so that is a kind of modern incarnation of Parmenides' maxim that you can't get something from nothing. Some people might be worried that there are examples where you can get something from nothing, especially when you look at set theory and the empty set. I don't think that's actually true. If anybody's interested in set theory, I can talk about it a little bit more in the questions, but I'll just leave that to one side at the moment. And we'll just take it as relatively plausible that everything must be constructed from something. But not everything must be constructed from something, but every construct must also be constructed by something, namely by its constructor, right? So the idea is here that we don't talk about any constructions whatsoever, but specifically about the constructions of kind of versions of the world. Each version of the world is constructed together with all the kind of stuff that world contains. This is something which must be constructed by some kind of mind, right? So you need the constructor as well. Yeah. And the final point we need in order to get the argument going is that the bases of construction temporarily precede the constructs. So if you construct something, it takes time. And so if you construct A from B, B must have been there before A, before the process of construction starts. Okay, so what does that get us, or where does it leave us? Well, it gets us to the idea that there must be minds all the way back, right? So if we accept universal constructivism, we also need to accept that minds have always existed. Well, why is that? Well, of course, so first of all, we said, okay, so every construct needs to be constructed from some basis, and because this is foundationless, every basis needs to have a further construct it is constructed from, and so on, all the way back, right? But then this process also takes place in time, so the constructs have to be prior to the to what they're constructed from, and they're constructed by a mind, which also has to be there. And so you can trace the minds through the entire history of construction. Yeah. So that brings us, together with premise one, directly to the Madhyamaka notion of universal emptiness and the more general Buddhist notion of beginningless ignorance. Now, and in fact, it should not be too surprising that there is a fairly direct connection between the extreme constructivism we find defended in theories like Gutmann's ways of world making and the Buddhist notion of beginningless ignorance that extends infinitely backwards, and the necessity of having sufficiently many minds present at any temporal stage of the infinitely regressive process of construction. Now, okay, so this is, I think, quite interesting consequence of this particular theory. Now, this is by no means mainstream in contemporary metaphysics. This is a fairly extreme form of constructivism, but nor is it particularly fringe either, right? So it is one option of many. But I think it gives us a really interesting way of connecting certain ideas in contemporary thinking about metaphysics and dependence with the Buddhist notion of rebirth, reincarnation, and mental continuity, right? Of course, you might just then say, look, in Goodmanian constructivism always sounded a bit weird. Now we also realize that it explains that minds have always existed. Now that shows me that there must be something wrong with the theory, right? So I'd rather do it without that. But that is, this is par for the course, for every argument where A implies B, you can turn it around and say, well, I reject B and therefore I reject A. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to move on to the final part of today's talk, and this is the second theory. It's a theory of cosmological duplicates, right? And there are basically two different ways you can spin this. If you want to read more on this is a fairly active area in contemporary discussion. There are two references in the notes down there. So one idea is that if we wait long enough, even very unlikely events will happen, right? So now you might want to say, well, this really contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, which says that on average and over time, order and structure in the universe will decrease and randomness will increase. Yeah? But this is, of course, a statistical law, right? So this is what tells you what happens on average and over time. Yeah? But if you wait long enough, even very unlikely events will happen, and even things like eggs unscrambling and broken cups reassembling again could happen at some point in time. And even more bizarre, it could happen that matter spontaneously reassembles in such a way sometime in the future that it produces the exact duplicate of the brain I have in my head right now, right? And so those are the famous Boltzmann brains, named after famous physicists. And so the idea is that, right, okay, so this could happen sometime in the future. And then, of course, you get the nice skeptical worry is, how do you know it's not already happening now, right? How do you know that you are not already a spontaneously manifesting brain sometime in the future that thinks you are actually living in 2024? Okay, so this is one way in which this duplicate stuff could go. Another one, which is in a way much more straightforward, is the idea that if space is infinite, or at least very, very, very large, and if matter is evenly distributed across it, then somewhere there will be rearrangements of matter that are exact duplicates of my brain right now. right? So those would be the kind of cosmological doppelgangers, which are exactly like me. They're just very, very far away, but they're materially completely identical. And if matter produces the mind, then of course it'll produce a mind exactly like my own mind. Yeah. Okay. So this stuff is all fairly out there, but not so weird that you wouldn't find it discussed by cosmologists and philosophers. Now, the question is, of course, what does that all have to do with reincarnation? Well, one thing is, of course, the question whether we can regard these kinds of duplicates as causal continuance of ourselves. Yeah. So could we say that in some way that the Boltzmann brain in the future, or my cosmological doppelganger, at a late time in the universe, very, very far away, could we actually say that this is a causal continuant of me? Well, first of all, that depends, of course, what we mean by causation. Yeah, my favorite response by a philosopher to any question is, of course, it depends on what you mean by X. Yeah? And so here it depends on what you mean by causation. Now, if we require that only physical and psychological processes that are very similar to processes that are ordinarily taken to connect different stages of a person are admissible, then it's evident that no personal continuity beyond the present body would be possible, right? But if you already have this restricted view of personal continuity, then you are presumably not concerned with the possibility of mental continuity and rebirth in the first place, right? Because if you think that all the causal connections must be like the ones that are happening right now, then you wouldn't worry greatly that whether or not there is continuity of the mind after the death of the physical body, because you can already say there isn't. Yeah. But in fact, you only have to make two fairly innocuous, I would say, assumptions in order to get some kind of idea of these duplicates as our causal successor going. And one is a counterfactual understanding of causation, right? So there are various different understandings in philosophy trying to figure out what causation really means. But one fairly mainstream one is a counterfactual one. And that says that a cause C causes an effect E in cases where if C had not occurred, E would not have occurred either, right? So, so I drop the cup and that causes it to shatter. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean by that if I had not dropped it, it would not have shattered. Yeah. Okay. So again, there is a lot of discussion about the adequacy of the counterfactual notion of causation, but we'll just accept that for the time being, right? And secondly, we accept that the mental depends on the physical. Yeah, just for the sake of argument. Yeah. So now, suppose that you have a specific mental event. Let's call that M. That has a specific physical basis, right? So I'll say what happens in my brain determines this event M. Yeah? Now, if I hadn't had that mental event, then what would happen in my brain also would be different, right? Okay, and that means that if you look at the whole universe, then of course the whole physical state of the universe would be different because what happens in my brain is part of what happens in the universe. Yeah. Now, of course, the state of the physical universe as it is now will be what is causally responsible for whatever happens in the future, including the existence of Boltzmann brains and so on. So, but if that is the case, then if this mental event had not occurred, then the future would have been different, and the physical arrangement of matter at a future time would have been different. And that means that there is, according to the counterfactual understanding, then the causal relation between my mental events now and whatever duplicates cosmology might consider there to be in the future. Yeah. So continuity of mind after death could then mean that we die now, and a long time in the future there will be a cosmological doppelganger who is just like us, assuming with all the karmic traces, right? And that would be our continuant or rebirth, and would be causally connected with us like a future self that wakes up from a deep coma or deep sleep. Yeah. Okay. So now wrapping up, where does that all leave us? Right. So, I mean, first of all, I think briefly to think about the differences between the two accounts I've just been talking about the Goodmanian constructivism and the stuff about the cosmological duplicates. Well, I like the Goodmanian approach, obviously, because it shows greater continuity with the Madhyamaka picture. The second approach, however, allows us to account for large-scale continuity of mental causal connectivity and mental development without having to move out of the naturalist paradigm, right? According to which the mind is what the brain does, and without having to make large-scale philosophical assumptions of universal constructivism, right? So this whole Goodman theory is fairly non-obvious, and you would think, okay, so if you could do without it, perhaps you should. Now, just to make it very clear that the aim of the arguments I've just been given is not to prove the continuity of mind after death, or to prove the existence of rebirth or anything like that, right? So it's not that I'm claiming to give you a kind of proof here that would refute all doubts on the matter. But what I'm interested in is actually something a lot more modest, and that is to show that there are intellectually mature ways for the Buddhists to account for mental continuity after the death of the physical body without dropping key naturalist assumptions about how the mind relates to the brain, ways that allow us to integrate these questions with contemporary philosophical and scientific discussions, in this case, discussions about constructivism and discussions about cosmological doppelgangers, in a way that locates these discussions on the large-scale philosophical map, right? So what I've been trying to argue here is that we shouldn't just say, okay, well, all these ideas about the continuity of mind after the death of the physical body and rebirth, they are based on ancient Indian understandings of how the physical world works. We know now more about that, and therefore we can show that all of these things couldn't have happened, right? I think this is very, very simplistic and also not really adequate in accounting for the kind of things we do now know, and also the ways in which we know how the universe is just very, very weird, even at a very basic level. So without introducing anything non-classical like quantum physics, even just thinking about the scale of the universe and the equal distribution of matter gets you into this kind of very unintuitive duplicate territory, right? So I believe there's much more philosophical territory to be explored here in conversation with these ancient Indian and Tibetan ideas. And I just think I've given you a very brief overview of these ideas here. But if you want to think more about it or read more about it, there were a couple of references already on the slides. And more specifically, there are these two papers which discuss materials from section 2 and section 3 of this talk in much greater detail. So if you are interested in all of that, I would recommend that as the first port of call. And there is then a lot more information in the bibliographies to these papers if you want to read even more on that. And that's really all I want to say tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Whoops, sorry. So we have a chance. Away from the speakers. We have a chance to have a question and answer period. So Binam, then.
Hello, thank you for the really interesting talk. So first of all, putting aside the whole question of whether like in our actual universe, if it's going to be the case that matter will be distributed eventually in space-time, in the future, I mean, certainly right now, when you look at the universe, we see that matter is not distributed evenly, and we also see that. And also there is the question of expanding universe, whether matter would distribute in ways such that they could recombine in infinite ways to reconstitute brains. Even putting that aside, even if you constitute the universe as all of existence, then I wonder how you tackle the problem that if all of existence is infinite in space and time, then that would mean that the duplicates would be existing not just in the future, but also right now in other existences or other parts of the universe, which would mean that they would essentially be like the other duplicate would also be me. And so in some sense, that seems kind of like paradoxical.
I mean, that is there is a problem there. I mean, one issue is, of course, that there is no such thing as universal simultaneity in the first place, right? So it's not there's no single now, and depending on how fast you are moving relative to others, what is simultaneous with you varies, right? And so relative to one context, an entity that is simultaneous with you might not be simultaneous in another context. So to that extent, you might be quite reluctant to put a lot of pressure on the notion of temporal coincidence here, because we can be fairly clear that that is not a fundamental feature of the universe, right? I mean, this is just in relativistic physics. It's clear that you don't have an absolute now. Yeah. So that's one thing you can say about it. But I completely agree with you. I mean, this one. There are various unresolved issues here, both regarding the natural science, and also the question to which extent this would form an adequate model of the Buddhist thinking about rebirth and reincarnation, right? I think what is important is that we note that there is a way of addressing these questions which doesn't automatically move them to, and this is a technical term writers have used about this matter, hocus pocus territory, right? So because I don't think that gets us very far in trying to understand what's going on here. That there can be a lot of disagreement about the details of this approach. I completely agree.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the wonderful talk. So I really agree with your point that rebirth is really fundamental for the Buddha Dharma. But just for the sake of learning, I want to ask a few questions. I think I would just ask one, even though I have a couple. But so for the first one, Gumanian constructivism, I'm just wondering, how is such argument different from the first cause argument? Because in a way, it also sounds like we are facing this problem of infinite regress, and we are tracing what's the beginning. And this is also a very typical argument for the existence of God. So in a Buddhist Madhyamaka context, if everything is a construct, then what constructs this mind as the first thing? And also, along the side of this challenge, it sounds like this argument suggests that the Buddhist notion of beginningless ignorance is compatible with this first cause argument, if I may call it. Then this beginningless ignorance becomes the beginning itself. But I feel like the point about beginningless is that we don't want to put a metaphysical foundation of this.
Thank you. Yeah, so I need to explain that better. Right. So the point about the Gumanian constructivism is that it's constructions all the way back, right? So you don't have any first cause or unconstructed basis that supports it all, right? Now, the main argument that you find in the kind of first cause arguments, which you are right, I mean, they were often used in order to work as an argument for the existence of God in cosmological arguments and so on. The main reason you find there is saying, look, if it wouldn't, if there wasn't a first cause on unconstructed level or fundamental level, then the whole hierarchy would collapse, right? There wouldn't be, because there's no beginning of that sequence, it could never have gotten started, right? And for that reason, we have, as a matter of logic, to assume a first cause, right? Now, people have now realized that this is actually not true, and there isn't anything logically wrong with sequences that go all the way backwards, right? And we can take very simple examples, like, the negative numbers, they go all the way back. There's no smallest negative number. And to that extent, of course, the negative numbers never started anywhere because there's no smallest one. But that doesn't mean that you can't make sense of their sequence. And and you can extend that idea to all kinds of foundationalist structures where you have dependence relation or grounding relations or construction relations that go infinitely backwards, right? And there's nothing formally wrong with that. Of course, that doesn't tell you that it's true, right? But if there was something formally wrong with that, and that would lead to a contradiction, it would definitely tell you that it's false. Yeah. So where we get to here is basically that we have two options on the table. You can be a metaphysical foundationalist, or you can be a metaphysical anti-foundationalist. And both of these are perfectly viable options insofar as neither of them is logically inconsistent, right? And this was so this is, I think, the picture that people have pretty much now. And which means that if you are a foundationalist, then you actually have to present an argument for why you think there must be a first cause or a fundamental level or an ultimate level. You can't say, well, the main reason for that is if there wasn't, there would be a contradiction, because that's not true. Yeah. So to that extent, you need an argument here, and the onus is definitely on the foundationalist. Yeah. So okay, so this is the first point. The second point is so nobody would want to argue here that anadi avidya and so on is then some kind of foundation, right? Rather, what is happening, according to this argument, is that if it's all constructed and it's all constructions all the way back, and construction is a fundamentally mental process, then it's mind all the way back, right? But that doesn't mean that mind is ontologically fundamental, right? It just means there's an infinite sequence of mental events that has no starting point. Yeah. But that's fine. That does not commit you to a foundationalist theory. It just commits you to a theory that says that there is no time in the past where minds did not exist.
So we'll have Shireen, and then there are 3 questions from Zoom.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I think that within the framework that you set out of like, what is the terrain of your investigation, I'm kind of equally convinced or interested enough in both of these possibilities to think about them further. But that's not my question, because I think I want to just ask about the larger project, because you concluded by saying that you thought that there's, fruitful possibilities for a conversation between Buddhism and other kinds of philosophy and naturalism. But I guess my question is, why is it actually even important for Buddhism to try to find a way to get integrated into the naturalist paradigm? Well, why? Because I think Buddhist philosophy can give a perfectly good account, like how the naturalist paradigm itself probably came about. So I feel like there's lots of interest these days in these conversations between Buddhism and science, but I feel like that's just a kind of a polite way of saying that Buddhism somehow needs to prove itself to science. So it seems like kind of an asymmetrical conversation that is starting out by not taking Buddhist philosophy seriously because it somehow can't fit into the paradigm of naturalism. And therefore, the paradigm of naturalism is like already thought to be trumping the possible value of Buddhist philosophy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is a very good point. It's so I don't think that the point I was trying to make here is that we just have to accept the naturalist understanding of the relation between mind and body as a fact, and then we have to see how Buddhism matches up relative to that, right? But what I'm more interested in is the question to what kind of assumptions you have to make for both sides or both parties to have a conversation without one feeling that the other begs the question, right? So when you have these conversations between Buddhism and science, the notion of the continuity of consciousness after death is definitely the elephant in the room, right? Because this is something which within contemporary understanding you find very little room for. Yeah. Now, but it is interesting to see, I think, that you could, on the one hand, try to find out, well, to which extent would there even be room for these ideas on the very kind of premises that the opponent accepts, right? So this is kind of, you accept these for the sake of argument, and then you try to derive something from that, right? And on the other hand, you might also want to say, look, well, there are also ideas within the Buddhist conception of mind and world that might make you see the whole scientific enterprise in a completely different way, right? And I think, if you look at Will's book on Yogacara here, I think that's a very good example of the idea of some perspectives that you can use in order to sort of reframe what is happening in the Western naturalistic tradition. And then you see, well, if you look at it from a specific perspective, then it looks as if it actually shouldn't be conceived of as a kind of foundationalism or materialist foundationalism, right? So I definitely agree with you that it would be pointless to have a discussion here if we already assume that the assumptions of one side are all true, and therefore the other one has to measure up against this. So what we really need is a way of conceptualizing what the other side does from the premises that the opponent accepts, right? Because that's the only way we can have a conversation, because otherwise you either say, well, what they are saying is hocus pocus, or you're saying, well, then they're missing the point. Now, and then you can't have any discussion. No?
Thank you. So there are three questions. I'll read them, the three of them, and then you figure out how you want to.
Well, perhaps one at a time, right? So,
one at a time? Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer, well, unless they have three times the same question. I think
no, they're similar, but not.
Okay,
So,
well, let's start with one. And then
let's start with one. So you mentioned that there are some example, the set theory.
All right, yes.
That refutes point 2A of a Goodmanian constructivism.
Yeah.
A point that seems quite compelling. Could you say more about that?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm delighted somebody actually wants to know about set theory, so I can I can say a little bit about that. Okay. So so just to remind everybody, so this idea was the question whether you can actually construct something out of nothing. Yeah. And so here to every construct must be constructed from something. Yeah. And now you say, okay, so if you look at set theory, then you can have such an entity as the empty set, which is the set that doesn't contain any members. And you can, in fact, prove that there must be such a thing and exactly one such thing. Yeah. And once you have that entity, that empty set, then you can construct all set theoretic constructions from that set simply by putting it into other sets in complicated ways. And when I say all set theoretic constructions, you can basically get all structures that you want, including number theory, and so you could basically reconstruct the structure of the world on the basis of nothing. So that seems to be a clear counterexample to what is going on here, right? But whether that really is a counterexample depends on whether set formation should be thought of a kind of composition operation that makes a new thing out of many things. Yeah. But I think a much better way to think of forming a set, and that's the fundamental operation of set theory, is what is sometimes called the lasso hypothesis. So it's a kind of collecting operation, right? So you put things in a bag, and you can also have an empty bag, right? Now, you can construct a whole hierarchy of empty bags containing further empty bags and so on, and you put more bags around it in complicated structures, and you get something really, really big and complicated. But what happened is that you haven't constructed something out of nothing, but you have constructed something out of one thing that you have, namely the composition or the set forming operation, right? It's not a thing, but it's a function. Yeah, and you put them together in complicated ways. So to that extent, the empty set isn't really nothing. It is something, but it is something that doesn't contain anything. So to that extent, I think that response to Goodman is actually not as compelling as one might initially think. Okay, number 2.
Number 2, you answered. So here is number 3.
Okay, number 3.
So 2 thoughts. Thanks for your talk first.
Yeah.
2 thoughts. First, can the secular Buddhist just reject seeking nirvana and thus escape the suicide argument?
Mm-hmm.
They can compare themselves to people at the time of the Buddha who just went for refuge because of trusting the Buddha's advice and how they get more happy existence, but seek instruction on how to escape existence, and construe such Buddhists as rational on the view that everyone automatically escape existence. This is the approach Amod Lele has written about. I wonder what you think.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I mean, I think that is certainly viable if you think, okay, so well, we just bracket the whole point of nirvana, right? And all we're concerned with is things that relate to existence in this life. But it still strikes me as a somewhat decentered understanding of the whole Buddhist intellectual edifice, insofar as what caused Buddhism in the first place was the Buddha's obtaining of enlightenment and presumably obtaining nirvana when both in this life and then after his death. So if you take that out of it and you say, okay, well, this is actually not anybody that the practitioner should strive after, then in one thing, of course, it clearly contradicts what the Buddha is saying himself, which is that you should strive after that. But it secondly also, makes it such a boring theory that I can't really see what the point of that would be. And so, to that extent, I would think in this case the cure is probably worse than the disease.
So here's the second thought.
The second part of the third question.
The third question, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't see how to connect cosmological immortality to Buddhist ideas of karma.
Mm-hmm.
The counterfactual causal connection I have to my doppelganger is one I have in the same way to every future person.
Mm-hmm.
So who is my continuant?
Mm-hmm.
It can be the one most similar to me. Buddhist reincarnation allows for very great difference between lives, such as now being a human and later being an animal. How do we decide who has my karma?
Right. No, thank you. I mean, that is a really important question. I wouldn't claim that I have a sort of exhaustive answer to any of that. I think my aim was a lot more modest here, and that is to say, okay, so we have all these ideas of cosmological doppelgangers and duplicated brains and so on, and we can make a case for these not just being somewhere there in the universe, but understanding causation in such a way we can also see that we have a causal connection with them. right? Now, and that's really as far as all of this went. Now, the question that is asked here is, okay, so how do we know it's the right kind of causal connection, right? Because you can have lots of causal connection between lots of different things, and I have causal connections with things that are not my reincarnation, right? So I have a causal connection with this cup, but this cup is not me in any way, or my reincarnation, and so on. And I agree, there's a lot more to be said here, and it's certainly not the case that this would solve the issue. What I'm primarily interested, I was primarily interested in showing is that we can make a case on in this relatively simple paradigm of the idea of cosmological duplicates, of there being some kinds of causal connection between us and the duplicates, right? And that might be able to allow a way of discussing possibilities of the continuity of mind after the death of the physical body. But again, the devil is, of course, going to be in the details.
Hi. Sorry, I was a bit confused by the Boltzmann brain.
Yeah.
And specifically, what are the basic axioms that you're taking in understanding physics? Because from my understanding of things, thermodynamics doesn't necessarily predict the fact that every possibility is an option. They say that there's a probability of events that can happen, and a probability, and hence a probability of events that won't happen, and the sum of the two makes the probability of all the events, right? And so you're integrating in, so mathematically you're considering the fact that all possibilities are possible, but there's a form of causality in physics, and specifically in thermodynamics, in statistical physics, because it seems like once you finalize into a state, it kind of locks into you can reconstruct the initial condition of the states, and it leads to a lot of interesting things about retrocausality, but that's not really the point here. And so I was a bit confused, because it seems like it presupposes the idea that all possibilities are of events can occur within the universe, which doesn't seem to be in correlation with, I mean, at least our current understanding of the observable universe. Because then otherwise it would presuppose other things about the universe outside of the realm of what we're observing. And I think I got a bit confused.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, I think we can all agree that we don't see, eggs unscrambling and broken cups reconstituting and all of this kind of stuff, right? So, okay. So this is obviously not part of the observable universe. I mean, we would of course be very wary to go from it's not part of the observable universe, therefore it's not part of the universe, right? Because we are obviously have a very limited observation horizon of things that we could possibly see. Yeah, and now if something is a possibility, I assume one of the things that means is that its probability is not zero, right? Because if its probability was zero, then it's an impossibility of things that cannot happen. Yeah. So now none of these things, like the unscrambling eggs and so on, are impossibilities in that sense, like that they cannot happen, right? Is rather we don't observe them. And one explanation for why we don't observe them is that they are so very, very unlikely. So now that is all that is going on there. I mean, they certainly know. Nobody has ever observed matter spontaneously reconstituted itself as a brain, right? But the whole thinking behind the possibility of Boltzmann brains and so on is that even though these possibilities are very, very unlikely, they're not impossible. And therefore, given enough space and given enough time, these possibilities are going to be realized. Yeah? And it doesn't really matter when they're going to be realized, because if you are such a brain, then you might have the wrong idea of what time you are in, right? And even if you are, 200 million years in the future, you might still think you are living now. Yeah. So that's the whole setup of the idea. But I hasten to add that the whole notion of Boltzmann brains is certainly not anything that is uncontroversial or anything that people would even regard as something that is necessarily the basis of a skeptical argument, right? But again, there is a significant amount of literature on this stuff. So it is out there, but not so out there that you wouldn't find cosmologists thinking about it.
Another question from the Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
If rebirth is a serial continuity of the flame from candle 1 lighting candle 2 and so on, how does candle 2 retain the mental imprints and memories from candle 1?
Yes, that is the million-dollar question. That, of course, I'd be happy to refer here to the Yogacara experts on how that is supposed to work. Well, I mean okay, so just very briefly, the standard understanding is that every intentional action deposits a karmic seed within the current continuum, right, or the present mental dharmas. And of course, because I mean we are operating in a system of momentariness here, so every dharma is only very, very short-lived and then immediately produces its successor dharma. And then what happens when that successor dharma is produced? It's produced as an effect which has in it all the karmic seeds that the predecessor dharma had, right? So it gets kind of copied. Yeah. So to that extent, you can have the notion of momentariness combined with the notion of the continuity of the vasanas, right? So, I mean, but having said that, I mean, this is a complicated story, which Yogacarins in particular have, and Abhidhamikas as well, have spent a long time scholastically taking apart and formulating in a satisfactory manner. But that is the rough idea.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments? Yes.
Thank you. I have many more questions, but one I want to ask now is I'm a little confused about the stress over brain or mind or memory here, because and as you said before, what goes into reborn is the karmic causal sequence that was carried over with a Yogacara explanation carried over by Alaya Vijnana. So we are not really talking about mind or brain or this thing, because like I don't have my memory of my past life. So so and this is kind of the basis of the second cosmological duplicates argument. So I'm just wondering, because
well, I mean, you don't have to assume that whatever is your successor actually shares your memories, right? So I mean, all you need for this discussion to work is that you have some kind of causal connection between these two entities, right? Between you and your doppelganger, right? But it might well be that whatever duplicate you are connected with in the future is something that doesn't carry on any of the memories that you have now, right? All that there needs to be for this, at least on the Abhidhamma picture, for this kind of continuity to happen, is that there's a causal sequence that connects the two. Yeah? And then, of course, it's the case that with most beings, they don't have any memory of what happened in one or various past lives, and that's fine, right? So you don't have to assume that on this framework it would sort of imply that we can perfectly recall whatever happened before. Right? That is not necessary. All that is necessary is to assume we can connect these kinds of different entities by a causal sequence. And that gives us a basis of trying to explain why one might be regarded as the continuant of the other rather than as some completely different thing. Yeah.
So if we're going to like refuse calling this thing duplicate in the sense of memory, but also if we're going to refuse calling it a duplicate in the sense of like it's the structure of its form or body,
then wouldn't it be misleading to call it a duplicate then? Like,
Yeah, I mean, well, you wouldn't want to call it a duplicate insofar as it has the same properties, right? I mean, all you need is basically you've got some entity now, some being or some brain, or what do you want to call it, and then you've got some other thing that is also a kind of a brain or kind of an animated being, which might exist at a completely different part of the universe a long time in the future, perhaps with a big temporal gap between them, right? But as long as you can still make the right kind of connection between the two, and this is what this has all been about, trying to see to which extent you can regard the second as an effect of the first, then you can still say, okay, so one is the continuant of the other, right? This is what you want here, because otherwise you can just say, well, there's one being here and then there's another being over there, and they have nothing to do with one another, right? What you want to do is this kind of connection. So that's all you need. I completely agree with you. I mean, calling it duplicates at that level is highly misleading, because then you assume that it's basically the same thing, and that this is not anything that you would have to assume in those kind of theories. No, thanks.
Thank you so much. So we would like to thank you very much for some little gifts from Engineer Shea.
Thank you, a nice bag. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really wonderful. We hope that you come back and do this again. We enjoy it every time.
Well, and thank you for your questions.
And wishing you a good stay in Nepal.
Thank you very much.